Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special presentation of Hair of the Dogcast, your favorite podcast about video games and beer, and licensed horror video games, the best, the worst, and everything in between. My name is Brad. Tyler and Dylan are both off at work right now, but luckily I had the day off because I wanted to talk with a very special guest that we have joining us. We are joined today by Daniel Richardson, a filmmaker, documentary maker, producer, who's involved in this awesome upcoming horror video game documentary series called Terrorbytes. Dan, how are we doing today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Terrorbytes. It's a 5-part series. It's upcoming. We're in the pre-campaign phase of it right now. The way I found out about it was actually through the trailer. Popped up on my Instagram, and wow. The trailer got me so excited. I had to check it out. I immediately went on there, and I kind of learned about the campaign, and so excited for it.
Well, first of all, I'm going to say that I'm very glad you liked the trailer because I have edited both of the trailers so far, so that's very good to hear. Terrorbytes. In case you don't know what that is, it is the latest documentary from Creator VC. We are a studio that deal in massive, large-scale, retrospective documentaries, probably most famously known for our In Search of Darkness series, currently streaming on Shudder. Those were 3, coming up to 4, 5-hour-long documentaries looking at the history of 80s film horror, going through the entire decade with some of the people that made the film, some of the people that starred in the films, people like makeup artists, and all that kind of stuff. We also recently did a gaming documentary that was kind of the same thing, but for first-person shooters, looking at the 50-plus year history of the first-person shooter genre, talking to people like John Romero and John Carmack, who made Doom, Warren Spector, who made System Shock, the guys behind GoldenEye. It was really, really well received, and people seem to like it a lot. And I'm personally, my gaming jam is, as you can probably tell from what I'm talking about, it's horror gaming. So about 9 or 10 months ago, I spoke to the CEO of the studio, and we were talking about In Search of Darkness and the 4th one coming up, which I'm a creative advisor on, I'm happy to say. And we talked about FPS stock having a very good launch around the time. And I said, I think it's time for us to do what we did for 80s horror and what we did for first-person shooters, and what we've also done for other genres, like we did a long doc on 80s sci-fi and stuff. I think it's time we visit horror video games. We're big specialists in horror. We've just had a very successful video game documentary. Let's put together this large-scale retrospective documentary going through the history of horror video games and all of its subgenres with some of the people who made those things possible. And he sort of set me off to go do my pitch deck and my market research and all of the dull, uninteresting stuff that comes before all the cool, exciting stuff we're doing now. And so I worked on that for a good while, got a lot of really, really cool names attached. If you look on the website, terrorbytesdoc.com, you'll be able to see our full cast list, which is still expanding. And even though it's not yet finished and we're still announcing names, if you follow us on socials, you'll see we'll announce names pretty much weekly. We have an incredible lineup of amazing talent. Some of my personal heroes are going to be involved in this thing, so I'm very excited about that. And we obviously, we dropped the trailer. The first trailer got us lots and lots of positive reception, people kind of covering it in Fangoria and Bloody Disgusting and Dread Central before we even put out a press release. Lots of people being like, when can I get this? And we had a lot of survey responses with people requesting people for the series and who they wanted to see and what games they wanted to see. And we just kind of got blown away by the the enthusiasm and passion people have had for this, and now it's finally coming to the point where we are selling it. We are in our pre-sales funding campaign now, and you can, go on the website. You can grab a digital or a physical Blu-ray edition. If you get a physical Blu-ray, you get a numbered edition. And there's lots of other real cool goodies on there that I'm sure you'll be able to look into. We'll certainly talk about on this podcast, no doubt. But and as a special sort of pre-sales bonus, every single purchase of the documentary at this point in time also comes with our previous FPS stock. So that means you're getting 10 hours of documentary content at an incredibly high level, featuring some of the best talent in these mediums for the price of one. So that's very exciting.
Absolutely. That's a banger of a deal. The pre-sale campaign, that's going on for a little while longer, right? March 3rd or 5th, I want to say?
March 3rd is when we officially close the campaign. So we're running a 25-day long campaign. It's going to finish on March 3rd. And in that time, you can help us fund the film. And you can, as a special thanks from us, you'll be getting your name in the credits. You'll get access to a lot of exclusive pre-sales merch that won't be available further down the line. And you'll also get access to what we try to do, because we know, obviously, we're asking people to sort of help with fund the production now, but they're not going to see it until our delivery of Q1 next year, to help people, kind of give them a reason to back now and give them something to look forward to. In the meantime, we'll be hosting a series of live events throughout the year that you'll gain access to. So these might be things like Q&As with developers. There might be like gaming playthroughs with some of the people who made them. There might be some behind the scenes stuff. But there's going to be over 15 plus hours of that. So all in all, you're getting, 25 hours worth of content minimum when you back at pre-sales.
Yeah, and I know I'm always wary to go onto Kickstarter or to back video games or anything that's not out yet, but y'all have a proven track record with all these other amazing series that you've done before. So I was very enthusiastically jumping on the campaign myself. And I was happy to reach out to you and get a response so quickly, because I want to talk about horror video games.
Please do.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited to talk about horror video games. This is the reason this documentary exists, is purely on the back of me being a huge nerd for this stuff.
And Dan, I'd say this is an audio podcast, so people can't see you, but you're a young-looking guy. I would imagine you might have started around the Nintendo, perhaps?
Yeah, so I was born in 1992. So my primary entry point into games was technically the Master System. The first game console I ever played was the Master System, and I played Alex Kidd in the Miracle World. That was the first game. But I don't know if that counts, because I literally played that game before I could walk. So in terms of what I actually grew up on, we're talking like Super Nintendo onwards. But I have, obviously, I'm such a huge fan of games that are like a genuine passion for me. So even though it's before my time, I have played, almost all of the notable titles from the NES library to completion. I've played stuff on Atari, I've played stuff on Amiga, Commodore 64. I'm not one of these people that only plays stuff that they grew up with and onwards. I'm very happy to kind of go back and revisit titles. I mean, primarily the things that I'm playing the most at the minute are PS1 games. So I am not sort of stuck to any time frame when it comes to like my gaming preferences. I do own obviously modern consoles and stuff, but like, some months it's a Dreamcast month. I don't know what to tell you. It's just one of those things.
You want to play that sick Ring game that they got on there,
Terra's Realm. Oh, it's a rough one, but it's very fascinating that it exists. That's one of the licensed games that people forget about exists in history. It's a very interesting title. I can't help but feel when I play it like it was never meant to be a game tied into the Ring, and they just sort of retroactively fit the license in, because it certainly feels that way. It does not feel like it is in any way attached to the Ring franchise, but what a fascinating little thing that is. I love the obscure horrors. I love
Sure.
the weird ones. The Dreamcast is full of them. Obviously, you got Ring Terror's Realm, but also Blue Stinger is a really like weird, quirky, campy like thing. And then one of my favorites is Illbleed. If you've ever come across that, it is one of the most. Oh, it's so bizarre. It's another Dreamcast title because, again, Dreamcast just full of weird obscurities. All of them exclusive to Dreamcast that I've just mentioned, actually. So that kind of makes them even more obscure because they never got ports to anything else. But yeah, Illbleed is one of the strangest games you will ever play. Like, I highly, highly, highly recommend looking into it. It is a bizarre fever dream of grindhousey camp horror that just has some of the strangest but most interesting gaming systems you'll ever come across.
Yeah. So the Terrorbytes documentary series is broken up into 5 different episodes, and we're going to kind of focus on one of the topics for a little discussion today. A good excuse to talk about licensed, lethal licenses is what your episode's called, franchise-based horror video games. Which, it can really be broken down into, maybe 15, 20 different film franchises if you wanted to just go on the big names. And, even calling some of these horror video games might be being generous, like these Atari 2600 games. This dot is saving another dot, but... I didn't get to play a lot of horror video games when I was a young kid. My parents were a little protective, and if they saw something that featured Jason on the cover, they might not be too far into it. But yeah, so we're just going to talk a little bit about licensed horror games. Now, it looks like I did my research and I was surprised to find some weird ones too. I found the Ring game on the Dreamcast, which looked amazing. I saw that there was a Wii game based on The Grudge on Ju-on.
Yeah, so there's a that one's pretty good actually. I've got that one. I mean, it's not. It's it's good and it's not. There's a weird thing with horror games where like even when they're not good, as long as they're interesting, that they're still somewhat compelling.
Yeah.
So the Grudge video game
it's made by the director of the creator of the series, I believe, right?
Yeah, there's some really interesting talent behind it. So what the basis of that game is that it was made to be... You know how the Wii had that whole thing where it was like family friendly and accessible, and your grandma could come and play Wii tennis. So for some reason they decided to do that with The Grudge, which I'm like, I understand trying to make your games accessible, but it's a weird IP to be like, oh yeah, like let's get all of the, let's get your nana around The Grudge. And it's a pretty short experience, and it was billed as a haunted house simulator. So you pretty much just walk around with a flashlight and jump scares happen. But it's meant to simulate, like when you go to those, like, it's more of a thing in America. It's not really a thing over here, to be honest. But you go to, like, around Halloween, they have all those like haunted house walks, and you walk through the things and people jump out at you, and they've got actors with like chainsaws and stuff. So the gimmick was it was supposed to be one of them. The idea being like, people love those and people go in all ages and anyone can pick this up, and you just played it with the Wiimote. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I played it, you didn't even use the nunchuck. It was literally just a Wiimote. Like, they simplified that as much as possible. And I've got a real fun story about that one, actually, because while it's kind of a critically lambasted title, like, with the right audience, it's a lot of fun because it does actually simulate some of the experiences of that kind of haunted house vibe. I remember I played it around shortly after release with my girlfriend at the time, and it was good because it was a game that she could play even though she was only just kind of getting into games around then, and because it's such a simple game, but being that it was like her first exposure to horror within the medium, like it scared the living daylights out of her. She was terrified of it. And when you play it, like, I think a lot of people approach that game specifically treating it like, you know, oh, well, this is like a survival horror game on Wii. And then they're looking and they're saying, like, well, it's a pretty shallow experience. There's not much depth to it. But if you play it like it's a party game, like you and your mates are all going to like a haunted house at Halloween, then it's super fun. It can be a lot of fun in the right environment.
It actually kind of functions really well as a Wii game because, you know, it's not gameplay heavy. It's experiential. It's just walking around a haunted house. And I think that's super effective. As soon as I got the PlayStation VR, one of my favorite things, every time I had a different friend over, I'd put him in Until Dawn, Rush of Blood.
Yeah.
And man, big fan of that game. And anything that's super engaging, but also light on gameplay, I think translates the horror experience very well, which is, I think, you know, a big challenge of the licensed games. It's all right. I love Halloween, Michael Myers. How do we put that into a video game? Or, you know, you have Nightmare on Elm Street. And I like the two of the earliest examples I could find were the Atari 2600 with Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And one of them, you play as the babysitter saving kids, and then in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you play as Leatherface killing trespassers.
Just massacring people.
And it's kind of like
very controversial at the time. I believe, obviously I wasn't alive at the time, but from everything I've read, stores used to have to hide them behind the counters, and you had to ask for them specifically, like you asking for like a nudie mag or something, because they couldn't put them on display. And a lot of them had the box art removed, so it would just be like a red case that just said Halloween, or a black case that just said Texas Chainsaw, and you wouldn't have, like, you know, the kind of iconic film covers that the game was originally published with. And it's baffling to think of them as being like so controversial when you actually play or look at them, because, you know, unless you said to somebody like, oh, this is like a Halloween adaptation, or this is meant to be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if you just presented someone with the abstract pixels of it all, you would have a hard time guessing what those things even were. They're so primitive. Like, obviously with the context of like, oh, you are a chainsaw wielding maniac and the goal is to massacre as many people as you physically can, it kind of becomes, when you look at it through that lens, clear, like, oh, this is kind of like very violent for the time. But like, you could literally just call this like tag. Like stick. You could have called it like stick tag and just said the dude's holding a stick and he's got to tag other people with it, and no one would have been any the wiser. And like, it would have just been like a normal Atari game. It's so interesting to see how much we've come when you look at something like that. And then, you know, you go all the way to the modern day with a licensed title like Alien Isolation. Like, it's crazy.
I mean, if you really wanted to break it down, one of the first survival horror games would be Pac-Man. You're getting chased by 5 ghosts. You can all of a sudden you grab whatever you need to turn the fight around, and then you're chasing them. You know, it's asymmetric horror's beginnings, really.
Funny enough, if you think of it as asymmetric horror as well, there is a GameCube game with Game Boy Advance connectivity called Pac-Man Versus. I do think it's been re-released on other things now, but it'll never be the same as having the GB8 GameCube cable. Where you literally play it as an asymmetrical game. So the people with the Game Boys can see the full map, and they play as the ghost chasing Pac-Man, and then the person on the big screen is Pac-Man and has to move around the big screen but can't see the whole map, and so there is that asymmetrical imbalance. I've never really thought, that's an interesting thought, I've never really thought of it as asymmetrical horror, but I suppose it's got the core mechanics down there, and it is ghosts.
Another one of the early ones that kind of wound up inspiring, you know, the horror genre in general is the Sweet Home game. Now, I didn't see the original film, but I did, you know, I know that the NES game is inspiration for the Resident Evil series. It's got a lot of the core mechanics of multiple characters, venture solo or in teams, unique items, puzzle solving, inventory management. It sounds just like, you know, a roadmap for what
Yeah, it even has the door animation. You know, the really iconic Resident Evil. Whenever you go through a door, it kind of disguises the loading screen with that atmospheric close up of the door slowly opening. Yeah, they did that in Sweet Home first. Resident Evil was originally meant to be a straight remake of Sweet Home before it evolved into its own thing. And if you haven't seen the film, actually, the entire thing's free on YouTube.
I'll have to check it out. It sounds like a good one. I'm down for any weird, obscure horror I haven't seen before.
Yeah.
I finally watched House for the first time, and I don't know if I was...
great.
Oh, man, it was so funny.
It's so weird. I love bizarre. But, not quite as surreal, but Sweet Home has a lot more of that kind of campy 80s Japanese horror vibes. So I'm not saying that remotely in the same league, but I think if you enjoy one or get something out of one, you'll probably get something out the other.
Yeah, the sequel, Sweet Home Alabama, is terrifying as well. Alien, I think, might have the most licensed games out of all of the franchises we could talk about.
Yeah, it has so many licensed games that even like a single licensed game for Alien is technically like multiple because take, for example, I think it's when they first licensed out Aliens as a game, there's lots of them launched at the same time, and I think a lot of, like uninformed parents would have thought, it was the same game on different consoles. But obviously the console spec between systems was quite drastically different at the time. So, the ZX Spectrum Aliens game is totally different to the one that launched on Commodore 64, is totally different than the one that launched on this other thing. And so it's like, even like one game ended up being multiple games, but they really, really hammer the games out in the Alien franchise. I mean, then you've also got like the Alien versus Predator stuff as well, which became its own gaming franchise.
It's weird that came out before the movie.
Yeah. There's lots of it's interesting how much licensed games actually have such a like important role in the horror genre, because if you think of licensed games, like historically, it's kind of been a bit of a bad word. Like if you described something as a licensed game, that normally meant you were saying it was like shovelware,
less than,
like, it was like some crap that they brought out to promote the movie, cross promote with the movie, and it was never like fully fleshed out, made to be a game. And like there was like a whole period of like rough around the edges, like crappy platformers on the SNES, like the Karate Kid game, not the Karate Kid games, the Three Ninjas platformer game, like stuff like that. It was like a knock against you to be a licensed game, and obviously like LJN have that whole history of producing just hundreds of them to really, really, really bad quality. But with horror, it's one of the rare genres where the licensed titles are super important to the development of its history. It's one of the reasons we're doing a whole episode on it, because you did start off with this kind of janky mess of Texas Chainsaw and Halloween.
Friday the 13th.
And then, they're rough around the edges. They've got their benefits, they've got their fans, but like, it's a lot of it's tied in with like nostalgia of the films, and that was kind of the only thing we had to play that was sort of close. Well, wasn't really close to what we're seeing on screen, but was a representation of what we're seeing on screen, even if it was through abstraction. But as you kind of get in and dive into licensed games, you've got loads of like really interesting and key titles. I mean, one of I would argue one of the most important horror games of all time, and I'm not including Sweet Home there, which arguably would also fall under that title. But Parasite Eve is technically a licensed game. People don't think of it as a licensed game because it's not being adapted from a film. It's adapted as a sequel to a book, actually. But yeah, Parasite Eve is originally a book, and they picked up the license and made like a whole series of games out of it. We're on to the third one now. Hasn't been a new one in ages. There probably should be, because it's an amazing franchise. But that is such a like, that's such a cultural phenomenon that, one of the biggest bands in the world has a song named after it in Bring Me the Horizon's Parasite Eve. Like, it is significant. It is a known, beloved classic title, and people don't even realize that it falls under the umbrella of like a licensed title.
Yeah, Parasite Eve, the first one came out on the PlayStation, right?
Yeah, so they're all PlayStation titles. The first two came out on PS1, and then there was one that's lesser known that came out on the PSP quite a bit later, and there hasn't been anything still since then.
Yeah, so as far as causing, genuine scares, I mean, I would argue it's not really until the PS1 that video games are able to become, engrossing enough to where jump scares can become a valid thing. It's one thing to be afraid of dying in a video game, but the first time a dog jumps out of a window in Resident Evil, that's iconic. And the PlayStation 1 era seemed like when horror video games started to kind of come into their own.
So I definitely don't disagree with you, and that's what sort of really put them on the map. The PS1 was kind of the golden age that kicked off like a whole new renaissance of horror games, as brought on, initially by Resident Evil, but then equally you also had Silent Hill follow shortly afterwards, and that became, a hugely influential and important title, not just in horror games, but within games history in general. But actually, I do think there are some genuinely scary titles that precede the PS1. For me, one of the games that I really, really love and think still holds up to this day, and I'm very glad to say we have the creator of in Terrorbytes, is Clock Tower, specifically Clock Tower, the first Fear, as it gets called over here, because Clock Tower did have a PS1 release, and that's the one a lot of people played over in the West because that actually had an English release. But if you go back to the original Japanese Super Famicom release of Clock Tower, which, like I say, we've dubbed Clock Tower the first Fear, that game, even within the limitations of the SNES, even with this kind of, pixel art style, point and click controls, and this sort of really digitized sound, it manages, when you actually play it, to have so much atmosphere and tension. It is a genuinely, genuinely scary game. Scarier than some of the titles on PS1, actually. And it manages to do it with such impressive technical limitations. And if you go back even further than that, the very, very first survival horror game, 3D Monster Maze, is actually pretty scary too. It still holds up. Holds up is a strong word. It's very, very, very primitive. But the idea behind it is literally you just navigate a 3D maze while a monster chases you through it, specifically a dinosaur.
Yeah.
And there is still something scary about, the little text at the bottom of the screen that says, he's coming.
Yeah.
He's getting closer. It's intense. It's very, very primitive, but it's it holds up. It's in at least in the fear factor, it holds up a little bit. And then obviously before Resident Evil, you've also got Alone in the Dark, which kind of laid the groundwork for Resident Evil, and that was kind of around the same period, so you could lump it in with that, but technically, it was PC before PS1.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons I'm so excited to watch fucking Terrorbytes, because I'm learning so much already. I've never even seen Clock Tower before, and you're right. I'm looking at these images and they're atmospheric. Yeah,
Hifumi Komo really took a lot of inspiration from Dario Argento films for Clock Tower. Specifically, I want to say Phenomena. I might have got the name slightly wrong. It is a film I've seen, but I'm just struggling to.
Yeah, Phenomena.
So it's one of the ones with. Yeah, it's one of the ones with Jennifer Connelly in. That is there's a lot of shades of that in Clock Tower. But yeah, I'd really recommend looking into Clock Tower. It's phenomenal, and it also really established as a game mechanic the idea of a stalker killer. So, these characters like Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 or Nemesis in Resi 3 or the alien in Alien Isolation. You can trace that back to the Scissor Man in Clock Tower, who follows you throughout the whole game. He is the omnipresent force that you cannot defeat, you cannot kill, you can only hide from and hope for the best. And that's sort of something that we really, really celebrate now as being like one of horror gaming's greatest achievements. But it really all goes back to that original display of it on Super Famicom.
Awesome. There's also a ton of licensed games which I would fall into the not scary category. The Super Nintendo and like that generation has some really wonky, like, let's make a platformer out of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah. I think the Sega CD has like a version with like janky like FMV sequences and stuff as well.
Yeah.
To be honest though, I as much as they're not scary, I don't think horror as a genre necessarily has to be scary to be successful. It's interesting how much, and this is something we want to touch on within the documentary, it's interesting how much horror has shaped gaming and not just what we necessarily think of as horror games, even though technically they are horror games. So what I mean by that is titles like Doom. Doom became so popular as a first-person shooter, and that's obviously its clearly defined genre, that people forget it's also a horror game because it doesn't scare them now. But it was initially made with like the satanic imagery was a conscious horror choice. They wanted you to be scared of the cyber demons and stuff when you heard that horrible T-Rex like growl around the corner. There's stuff in, Castlevania that, while not a horror title in the traditional sense of, it's going to have things jump out at you in the dark and go boo, but it is very much informed by like the Victorian Gothic and all of the Hammer horror period of films. And so much of that is kind of like the horror imagery is so important to games that I think if you look at it as the roots of so much evolution, you can kind of like trace the paths between things like, okay, well, Castlevania was sort of playing with horror imagery and, the Metroidvania structure, and like that sort of led us into things like Bloodborne and Dark Souls and stuff like that. And even though we don't necessarily think of I will argue till I'm blue in the face that Bloodborne is a horror game.
Oh, absolutely.
But even though we don't think about, I know some people are like, oh, it's not a horror game, it's a Soulsborne. I'm like, yes, it's a horror Soulsborne.
I'd say Elden Ring is a horror game too if people want to start arguing stuff.
Well, this is the thing. Like, there's so many arguments to be made because horror imagery was so sort of crucial to gaming's formative days that as we've sort of evolved and brought in new genres, a lot of the things we're looking to for inspiration were these games that were originally rooted heavily within either horror themselves or the horror imagery and horror atmosphere. And I think that's interesting.
To take it to like an extreme example, The Addams Family is a family comedy drama, but it is just, Addams Family movie is just dripping with horror imagery.
Yeah, totally. And then you look at something like, to go back to games, like look at something like Splatterhouse.
Yeah.
Like, you'd have a hard time arguing that isn't a horror game, but it's also like a side-scrolling beat-em-up platformer. Like, but it's so like what Castlevania did with gothic horror imagery, Splatterhouse does with, splatter horror imagery. It borrows from like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and all of those 80s kind of new wave of horror films that just sort of threw gore and viscera at the screen at all times.
Yeah, we briefly mentioned the Alien franchise. You mentioned Alien Isolation, which I played that game, and that is fantastic. Is there
so good?
Is there any Alien games you think stand out above the rest as far as important to the horror gaming genre?
Oh, Isolation, I mean, I know I've already mentioned it, but Isolation isn't just one of the best licensed games of all time. It is one of the best horror games of all time. I think it is such an important game in terms of not just being an incredibly atmospheric, brilliant experience that happens to be based on a licensed title, that also captures that license that it's, borrowing from.
And expands on it too.
To a completely perfect extent. Like, it captures the tone of the original Alien film better than anything else has since. Better than anything else ever did. Better than anything else has tried to do it. And that's the one where it's like, the horror the survival horror aspect is really sort of put front and center. So even though it's probably one of the more recent titles, it's definitely the one that's like the most important to the horror genre. Although, you know, some of them have the scary moments. There's certainly elements in the Marine campaign in the original Alien versus Predator where you're looking at that little radar and the beeps are happening and they're getting closer, where it definitely plays into the horror aspect of like you're playing as the human right now and they are the most vulnerable. So it's always, you know, because Alien itself as an idea and as a license is very malleable when it comes to how much it uses its horror. And so you see that a lot in the games because, you know, while Alien is a horror film, Aliens is more of a war movie. But Aliens does have those really terrifying scenes where they're trapped in the room with the two facehuggers. And so it really amps up the horror in those sequences. And we sort of see that reflected in the games where like Alien Isolation is a straight horror game, whereas AVP is more of an action game, but it has these really well-defined horror moments.
Yeah, and then extreme like Nintendo DS Aliens Infestation if you want to go to like 2D side-scrollers and everything. You mentioned before licensed gaming kind of having this negative connotation for a long time. And I mean, it wasn't, I remember, you know, like Chronicles of Riddick, the game came out for the Xbox. People were like, it's actually good. Or
Escape from Butcher Bay, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think that was what it was called, yeah.
And that seemed like, you know, a big roadblock for a long time. Do you have much experience with the Saw video games?
Yeah, I've played them. The first one isn't bad. The second one, we will be covering, we'll be touching on the Saw video games within Terrorbytes because I remember specifically the first one was actually pretty controversial. If you go on archive.org, you can dig up some reviews from back in the day where they are like, you know, that they're not saying the words ban this sick filth, but they're calling it like a torture simulator and, you know, depraved entertainment. And it's like, it's interesting that, you know, so many people wrapped onto this idea of it being a torture simulator when you play as one of the victims, not the killer. So literally the goal of the game was to not get tortured. The goal of the game was to escape. But you'll find that's kind of a common thread throughout horror games, especially when it comes to the controversies that people misinterpret the content of the game and just kind of run with that misinterpretation, and then suddenly it snowballs and it becomes this big game of telephone where one tabloid whispers to another tabloid and suddenly the game's full of like, you know, all of these other taboo things that aren't in there to begin with. It's an interesting thing. But yeah, honestly, the first Saw video game, I think you can still get it like working on modern systems. I think it's available in like Steam and stuff. But the first Saw video game, not bad. Not bad at all. Saw 2 ain't great.
Okay. Yeah, that was the first time where I felt the studio was super confident in using a franchise and we're putting out a product that, you know, it's worth the money. And I don't know, it just felt like it had a different vibe behind it, which had me curious again. Because I remember seeing the Evil Dead movies, Evil Dead games coming out, and I wasn't quite sold on them. But then I went to a friend's house and played them. And which one was it? Evil Dead, Hail to the King. I'm like, oh, this game's actually pretty cool. It's taking
that's the one that's on PS1 that does the like fixed camera angles and PS1 style gameplay, isn't it?
That's the RE clone, yeah.
Yeah. That one's pretty good. I was disappointed that a lot of the future titles went more with this sort of like beat 'em up style gameplay that didn't really vibe with this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice though that Bruce Campbell he's always down to come back, which is cool.
Oh, totally. It's great.
I'm really not that familiar with Dead by Daylight. It's always kind of been a thing that I see pop up, but there's like 30 DLCs, and I'm like, at this point, I'm too far removed. I didn't realize until recently that it is one of the progenitors of asymmetric, that horror survival gameplay, which is popular now.
It's the reigning and undisputed king, absolutely. And, you know, that's not to say, you know, it's the best one. I know some people prefer like Texas Chainsaw, and a lot of people had fun. Some people had fun with the Evil Dead game. I know most people were really, like, in terms of asymmetrical horror, the one that people sort of put on a pedestal more than Dead by Daylight tends to be. The Friday the 13th game, which unfortunately, because of copyright, is just going away, which really sucks. But yeah, Dead by Daylight is a super interesting one, because when that originally came out and tried to do the whole asymmetrical horror thing, it wasn't particularly well received. It wasn't really, like, it had its fans, and it was certainly, you know, a good solid game within its foundations, and it was doing a replication of the sort of slasher formula in a playable medium better than I think anything had done it before up to that point. But what really put them on the map, and this is where we talk about, you know, licensed games being so important in horror history, because now Dead by Daylight is one of the biggest horror games of all time. But what really, 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 really put them on the map was that very first license collaboration with the Halloween franchise. When they introduced Michael Myers and Laurie Strode to that game, people like sat up and took notice, and the popularity of it just exploded. Now it's basically, you know, it's like horror Fortnite. Like, it's got everything in it. It's one of the biggest games going, and it's got its own like internal store and stuff with cosmetics and things. It's huge. And if you do start to follow Dead by Daylight, I will say that the new chapter looks amazing. And one of the things I'm really glad they haven't done is they don't just, well, I'm really always really excited by the licensed inclusions, and it's always cool to see, you know, Chucky or the Xenomorph or like Hellraiser show up.
Stranger Things.
Well, yeah, Pinhead and Stranger Things and stuff. Well, it's cool to see those things show up within the game. The one thing I'm really glad they've done is they don't just rely on those licenses now. It's not just that. They still do their own original stuff. And their new original killer that they've literally just announced, you know, a couple of days before we're recording this, The Unknown. Oh my God, he looks so cool. They look so wicked. I recommend you look at the teasers they put out with all the like analog horror found footage. It's really awesome stuff.
I have the update downloading. I wanted to try and play it before today, but I was too busy watching Elden Ring trailer 1,000 times. But I got the tree. I got the update coming for Dead by Daylight, so I do plan on checking it out. Lots of franchises in that, and 2016. That game started in 2016, and it's still just popping off hard, which is hard to believe.
Yeah. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
And they have a film adaptation in development with Blumhouse, the last I heard anyways.
And the guy who's directing it is somebody I'm a big fan of. It's he did the Annabelle Creation.
Okay.
And Lights Out, which I thought was really good. He's a good horror director. He also did the Shazam movies, which I know people don't like as much. Well, the first one everybody likes, and then nobody liked the second one. But yeah, he's a great horror director.
David Sandberg.
And David Sandberg. He's also just a very cool and interesting guy to follow if you follow his YouTube. He's one of the few sort of filmmakers at that level that are very like transparent. And just will, you know, upload videos on YouTube talking like through like, oh, here's how we did this effect in Shazam, and just basically, I have no idea how he gets away with it, to be honest, because he drops like really like elaborate behind the scenes content that the studios probably in any other given scenario probably wouldn't want out.
Yeah,
you know, they're always very protective of this stuff, but he's really like good, and he's an interesting guy, and he talks about like how he got started in this, and I'm very happy to see him directing Dead by Daylight.
Yeah, and then I mean now it's just asymmetrical horror is very popular. You know, there's the issues you mentioned that with like Friday the 13th, which is just wild to me that they can make this game, which I watched more of it on YouTube than I played, because if you have a good crew, it's very fun to watch, you know, him get taken down, watching Jason get taken down. It's unfortunately rare, but do you know a little bit more about the licensing problem that went on with that? Like,
so I do, but it's a lot of like, it's wrapped up in a lot of things. I will, before I go on, I am just going to make a correction, because I've just realized David Sandberg isn't directing the Dead by Daylight movie, he's directing the Until Dawn movie.
Oh, yes. Cool.
Yes.
I'm excited about that as well.
Yes, I'm very excited about that too. I remembered him getting excited for him doing a big video game horror adaptation. I've just remembered it's actually Until Dawn, not Dead by Daylight. But yeah, the licensing issue, it's super, super complicated. And it's almost like the game stuff is really unfortunate, but it's almost like a byproduct of another conversation. It's not really that, you know, anyone's sort of withholding the license from them, or or they don't have enough money to renew. It's more that there's like this huge dispute that's sort of resolved, sort of still ongoing, and it's been messy and it's been going on for like years and years and years between I'm gonna have to remember the names here. Sean S. Cunningham, who was the director of Friday the 13th and carried on making the films as a producer afterwards. He is in dispute with the original writer of Friday the 13th. And they have been kind of having a battle over who actually owns the rights for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah.
And as a result, there's just like this weird mess of things where it's like, the courts are sort of saying like, so Victor, I believe is the writer, like he owns Jason's mom and some iterations of Jason, but you own Jason, and it becomes this big complicated thing where Sean Cunningham's saying like, well, I commissioned it from him and told him to write this, so I own the rights, and he's like, yeah, but I wrote it, so I own the rights, and that's why we haven't had a Friday the 13th film in like since 2009.
That wasn't Jason Goes to Space, right? That was the remake.
There was the reboot. Yeah, the reboot in 2009 was the last Friday the 13th film. And we've just had some solution in that court case. There was some things were wrapped up, which is why Peacock is able to make the Crystal Lake series that's coming up.
Okay,
but we still
the prequel series Crystal Lake.
Yeah.
Sounds peculiar.
Well, it is by the guys who made Hannibal, and they're pretty competent. So I'm hopeful for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, they still haven't really decided how the films are going to work. But apparently, you know, they've settled with TV rights, and Peacock managed to get it. But I really, really, really hope to get it sorted, man, because I want a new Friday the 13th so bad, and I would love it in an ideal world if the game guys got their license back. I don't think that'll ever happen. I think by the time this is all resolved, it's too late to kind of bring your audience back, and it'll be on old systems, and, you know, we'll have to port it forward. But, you know, maybe one day we'll get some version or some spiritual successor with that license. It would be great if we did. But yeah, they're just kind of an unfortunate casualty of war.
Yeah, it's nice with a game like that, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if you have been invested in the series and, you know, watched them all. It's the callbacks, it's the little references that really tie it together. And I remember as soon as I got that game downloaded, Friday the 13th, I'm like, all right, who do I recognize? And only a couple of them, from the third movie, I believe, the actual characters, and then Tommy Jarvis, but the costumes for Jason and the way you have to pretend to be his mother and that whole thing. It's the callbacks that I find really rewarding. And, you know, I played Texas Chainsaw Massacre briefly too, and I don't know, there's something about asymmetric horror games that it's just, you need a good group of people to be playing.
Totally.
And, you know, I played like that first week and I could tell no one knew what was going on. So it was all over the place, but I at least recognized the house and knew where I was going. Yeah. There's actually a new trailer, I think, released this morning for Killer Clowns from Outer Space. It's wild. Like, that's such an interesting IP to do one on. We've sort of been talking about it on our socials and asking people like, are you excited for it? You know, are you burnt out on asymmetrical horror? I mean, I hope they knock it out the park. It's such a kind of, like, I know technically all of these IPs are sort of cult, you know, like
Texas Chainsaw Massacre is recognized as like a bona fide horror classic, but like as a franchise, it's kind of a cult thing. You know, not as many people saw like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 and onwards.
Oh, they're so good.
Yeah, well, some of them are so good. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is so good.
I'll take Leatherface trying to use a spelling machine. Matthew McConaughey, they're all just so all over the place. You never know what you're going to get.
Wild tonal shifts, film to film. But yeah, and like Friday the 13th always kind of been like more of a cult thing. But Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Yeah, Killer Clowns is like next level cult. Like, yeah, it was kind of a popular movie, but only with a very specific audience. So I'm interested to see. I'm just really curious to see how that one goes.
The song for the trailer was so good that I'm like, I have good feelings about the movie, but that trailer was such a banger. I'm like, all right, I'm definitely excited for this now. And it's iconic. The imagery is burned into people's brains.
It'd be really fun if it like kicked off enough interest in the intellectual property to get a new film. Like that would be a great outcome for it.
I think it's got to happen. Anything that has a little bit of interest these days, people want to run with it and slap a dollar sign on there. And yeah, including the film Barbarian, which I don't know about that needing an asymmetric horror game.
What? This is new information to me. Barbarian,
yes,
as in the recent one with
Justin
the thing in the basement,
and
that's getting an asymmetrical horror game.
That's my understanding. That's being developed by Diversion 3 Entertainment, the studio behind Friday the 13th and Evil Dead.
Wow, I must have missed the news on that one. That's a choice. That's very recent.
Yeah, there was an article in Variety, October 27th of last year. It's getting a horror video game adaptation from Diversion 3 Entertainment, and I'm not sure about it. I understand there's a good basement. There's a good basement to run around in.
Very good basement
and a good creature, but I'm just curious to see how that would develop into a video game. Some movie, I don't know. The movie's so perfect. I don't know if we need to touch it.
Yeah, it's so like the reason it's such a weird one is it's so like insulated to its own thing. You know, it's very standalone. It's not really got like. And I love this film, and this is not an insult to the film, but it doesn't really have like a pop culture iconography that sort of spans out from its source material. It's very much just contained like really, really good, just fun, interesting, and thematically rich horror film. And what a weird one to pick. I'm gonna keep an eye out for that. I want to see how that develops.
Yeah. Is there any, I guess, VR? There's some VR experiences, some smaller games. There's a Paranormal Activity one I saw, Exorcist Legion. To me, VR is just super effective at horror. So even if it's totally not, if it's just a stationary room I can look around in and then something moves when I'm looking the other way, that's all it takes. Is there any licensed properties for VR you think stands above the rest?
Yeah, Exorcist Legion VR is really, really good. It's one of the reasons, well, specifically that and, the fact that we're doing a Lethal Licenses episode, we actually have the developer of that game in Terrorbytes. And, in terms of the VR world, he was one of the only ones we approached, actually, because not only did he make, a really good licensed horror VR game, but also he was kind of at the formation of like the VR horror movement, where he made Chair in a Room, which is like one of the older titles. We're talking like he made that when the only commercially available VR headset was the HTC Vive, which was the like $1,000 plus like specialized, piece of equipment with the big poles in the corner that had to be set up and stuff. So yeah, he was right at the forefront and has kind of followed VR through its evolution to becoming more and more of a like mainstream thing with like things like the PSVR and the Meta. And along the way, he made this really, really great license tie-in. I would go so far as to say that the Exorcist VR is a damn sight better than the movie it's based on.
It's not based on the original film.
No, it's not based on the new one. No.
Oh,
no.
okay.
I say based on. I mean to tie in with.
Sure.
It came out with alongside the new Exorcist film, and I think it's better than that.
Yeah, I feel like we touched on a lot of the big licenses. Blair Witch had a few games.
Blair Witch games are weird. So there is there's the Bloober Team game, which is like the more new one that was kind of a reboot. But yeah, the Blair Witch had like a few games that were like part of the same series.
Yeah.
But it also weirdly retroactively, those games introduced another unrelated game into their canon. What was it called? Oh, that's going to bug us.
Yeah, because I know it was came out in 2000. It was in 3 volumes, and it featured some time jumping. So some of it would be taking further place in the past, and some expanding the lore, but they seemed kind of more point and clicky. I didn't get a chance to look too close into them.
Yeah, there's a I cannot remember the name of it for the life of us, and Google search is terrible now, so I can't find it. It's going to bug us, and I'm really annoyed at myself for not remembering it.
You have to keep 500 games stored in your head at all times. I'll give you a break.
Nocturne.
Okay, got it.
There is a game called Nocturne where you play as it's almost like the Men in Black, but for horror creeps and stuff. So you are part of this secret organization that goes out and handles werewolves and vampires and zombies and all that, because they're totally real, but this secret government agency is keeping all that in check so nobody finds out. And that's why you get like the sightings of Bigfoot and stuff. That's when they didn't cover it up so well. And it's this I think it was around the 2000s PC game, and bizarrely somehow that is now canon to the Blair Witch universe because of the Blair Witch games that followed it sort of mention events that happen in Nocturne and acknowledge it as a thing. It's just a strange little fact that I really enjoy.
Yeah, it's like Wellington Paranormal but serious.
Yeah.
I think we hit all of the big ones. Is there any licensed titles that you think we need to mention before we wrap up here? I feel like we got a lot of the big ones.
Oh yeah, I've got a soft spot for it's not particularly celebrated, but I've got a real soft spot for the Vampire Hunter D game on PS1.
I love the anime. I never got to play the game.
Yeah, it's rough around the edges, but it's just got that kind of that PS1 style that makes it really, really charming. That would be one that I'd personally mention. And there's definitely more to talk about. There's the Thing video game that's got a lot going
how
for
do we
it.
forget the Thing?
Yeah.
That's a big one. I am a huge fan of the Thing, and I like how that expands as it's a sequel.
Yeah, it is a sequel. It's a sequel. And John Carpenter, I believe, has a cameo in it.
Yeah, they got his likeness, but he couldn't record all the lines, is my understanding. Yeah, the Thing is one that I played back in the day, but didn't finish it, and I since have just fallen in love with that series so much. Even the sequel, or the prequel, I should say, but that could have been so much better. It's one of the great what ifs the studio hadn't fucked around. Yeah,
totally. They actually had a lot of good practical effects stuff going, and then the studio was just put CG over it, just all of the CG over it.
3 scariest video games you've ever played.
3 scariest video games I've ever played. Ooh, damn. I personally found Outlast, but specifically the Whistleblower DLC, really scary. It's a hard one because I don't play the games particularly to experience being scared.
Yeah.
I actually think I just enjoy the themes and the ideas and the concepts of them more than I get scared by them. I actually think Resi 7 has its moments. I know Resident Evil's a bit more action heavy, and it's kind of to say that it's the scariest game ever is would raise some eyebrows and roll some eyes.
In VR, I can see that. In VR, it is.
Yeah. Resi 7's pretty spectacular. So Resi 7, Outlast, Whistleblower. It's so tricky. I think Forbidden Siren.
Okay.
I think that's pretty scary. They're probably not my final answers, but there's 3 for you.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry to spring out a tough question like that.
It's all good. Keep them coming.
Is there any recent horror films that you have seen that stand out? I mean, I'm always trying to find some new horror that is something either brand new, which is either extra campy or extra good. And I mean, there's so much garbage out there these days that it's hard to find.
Oh, yeah. So one of my... So this is either going to, depending on who's listening, this is either going to gain me a lot of credibility or lose me a lot of credibility. A horror game that I watched last year that I personally think is the scariest film I've ever watched, but that a lot of people will absolutely tear their eyelids off watching out of boredom, is Skinamarink. And I know people hate it.
I couldn't watch it with my wife. I tried to watch it with her, and it didn't work, so I had to abandon, and I haven't had a chance to check it out since then. That was like 3 weeks ago I tried to watch it.
What you got to do with Skinamarink, and this is my advice, and this is how I watched it, right? So I'd heard about it. I'd heard the whole buzz. It's like, oh, it's analog horror, but like, you know, depending on who you recommend it to, it's going to either like, you know, bore them to tears or it's going to like completely engross them. And I really, really wanted to like it. Like I went in wanting to like it. And I gave myself all of the opportunity to enjoy it. So I watched it alone in a quiet apartment in the dark at like 2 a.m. And for the first, like, I would say 30 to 40 minutes, I was like, oh my God, I hate this. This is so boring. This is terrible. I really didn't want to be the people that were like, this is just a PowerPoint slideshow. But I was one of those people for like that first 30 to 40 minutes. And then it was almost like, you know, when you're falling asleep, how you don't feel yourself falling asleep. You're awake and then you just are asleep. And there is a transition period, but you don't notice it. There was a point in the film where something happened and I didn't recognize the point I'd shifted from bored to engrossed. But there was just a moment where like something hit me so hard. And after like 30 to 40 minutes of being like, this is the worst, this is so boring, I can't believe I'm suffering, I'm forcing myself through this, where I suddenly went, oh my God, I'm terrified. I was sweating. I was like, I found that movie like an endurance test, not through boredom anymore, but like, oh my God, I never ever like get scared by films, but I was like, I don't know if I can make it to the end of this. This is scaring the shit out of me. So Skinamarink for me,
fuck yeah,
was awesome. You have to watch it like you are watching the cursed videotape from The Ring.
Okay,
you have to watch it like it is a forbidden artifact that you have found and you are watching alone on a mysterious night. And if you can. It is hard. So this is the thing with it. It's one of my favorites. I do not blame anybody for hating it. If someone came up to me and said, that film absolutely sucks, I don't know how you could recommend it to anybody, I'd be like, okay, yeah, fair. But if it hits you the way it hit me, if it gets on your wavelength, oh, that sweet spot. It's something special.
Yeah, I gotta watch it maybe by myself. I can sit there and, you know, wait through a long period of questionable boredom. My wife, she was just tuned out after the first 5 minutes. So yeah, I definitely want to give it another try. I've heard so many good things about it.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because once you get to the point, at least not everybody does. Not some people watch the whole film and it just never clicks for them. But when you do get to the point where it does click, it makes that first chunk make sense. You're like, oh, I understand why that had to be there. It's like a lull. You couldn't start the film here. It has to, you know, ease you into it, and it almost like it creates a false sense of security because you're like, is this it? Mm-hmm. And then because it ends up not being it, it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, it's such an interesting, fascinating film. What else have I watched recently? I've been watching a lot of documentaries recently. Actually, I really enjoyed Pennywise: The Story of It, which was like a documentary on the making of the original It miniseries. And I'm not particularly a big fan of the It miniseries, but I think the documentary gave us a lot more appreciation for it. And I also watched Stephen King on Screen, which is very good, apart from a strangely odd-paced opening 10 minutes and a weird sort of framing device. But other than that, it's a good retrospective documentary. So Skinamarink and 2 random documentaries is what I'll recommend. I will give you one more conventional one. You said recently, right? You said that had to be recently.
Last year, something like that, yeah.
Last year or something. Let me just real quick.
Recently, we watched the Haunted Swimming Pool film, and it is one of the worst movies I've ever seen.
Yeah, I haven't caught it yet. My brother told me it was very, very, very bad.
Oh, man. It's like, if you're going to have a haunted swimming pool, you have to know what lane you're in, and they take it very seriously. I
really like Talk to Me.
Talk to Me was really good.
Other people. Not as much as other people. I didn't like it as much as, like, I did really, really like it. So don't think of that as like, a backhanded compliment. I did really, really like it. A nice one for me was No One Will Save You, if you've seen that one.
I don't know.
It's an alien abduction film with very, very, very little dialogue.
I have not seen that.
It's literally just one person in the house trying to avoid getting abducted. And it's real interesting.
That sounds
because
awesome.
It doesn't do that. Yeah, it doesn't do that thing where like, character will like talk to themselves because they've got nobody to bounce off and like exposit and be like, oh, I have to get out of here. Like, maybe the window upstairs. It doesn't do that. It like plays it like, I don't want to say realistically because it's an alien invasion, but it plays it like, as if it's a real survival scenario and you're just watching this person kind of get through it. That one's really cool. And I really like Saw X. I'm a sucker for a good fun Saw movie, and Saw X is probably the best Saw movie, if we're completely honest.
It's crazy how big that franchise has gotten. I told myself I can't watch any of the new ones until I catch up, and I've probably missed 4 at this point. Right now we're on the Fast and the Furious franchise. And
nice.
Yes, big lore there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Saw X actually you could watch because it takes place after Saw 2 but before Saw 3.
Okay. After Saw 2. Yeah, I mean, the problem is when you kill a villain, you either bring him back to life or you are trapped in a recurring loop then.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think the creators who made Saw, the studio realized that the best thing about Saw was Tobin Bell. Tobin Bell, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, for some reason I second-guessed myself on his name there.
I can't remember my fucking wedding day, but I will remember like actors, It's the thing that our brains choose to save.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? But yeah, I think when they, spoilers, killed him off in Saw 3, they have spent the entire rest of the franchise regretting that decision, as is evidence from every film finding some archaic, obtuse, trivial way to somehow include him in the narrative.
Yeah.
And it just gets more and more convoluted how they manage to do that as it goes on.
He planned the next 6 movies before he died.
Yeah.
So
so many flashbacks.
What's the next steps for Terrorbytes now after the campaign is wrapped up, the pre-campaign, March 3rd? What's the next steps for you going forward? When do these interviews start happening? What do you have on your plate the next few months?
So I'll be looking we'll wrap up the campaign, and then I'm going to sit with the writer and director. We're obviously creating like a narrative structure and episode run times and pacing and stuff. I'll be sitting with them and we'll sort of finalize a lot of that. While that's going on, everybody will get the free copy of FPS stock. We'll start to set up the live events for people who will then be updated about them coming in. And then from sort of March to May, I'll be conducting all of these interviews along with my writer and director. And then we'll have like a post-production schedule of around 6 to 7 months. And then we're ready for having a final screener. Not quite picture lock, but like, it'll be like the final draft before the final draft.
Yeah.
That'll be sort of December, January, and then we'll just fine tune it until we're ready to deliver it in February and March.
Who does the music for the movies?
New Retrowave. So New Retrowave are they're more of a label than anything else. So they, we have like a deal with them where they have scored. It's a funny one because it's not like necessarily that they have scored. They have a lot of artists come in to score our films, so we use a lot of their tracks. Sometimes they'll do new stuff for the doc, or sometimes it'll be that they've got a track that's like perfect fit. But yeah, so it's going to be New Retrowave. If you go on the YouTube, you'll see all the kind of music they do and all the kind of artists they sign on and broadcast to a wider public. And yeah, they're a really, really great curators of these gorgeous sort of dark synth-wavy sounds, and it's very like horror evocative in places. So we're working with them to curate and produce like the most fitting and perfect soundtrack for this movie. And some of that might be custom, some of that might be stuff they've given away. It's always like a conversation. But yeah, they've scored I think all of the In Search of Darkness films. I know they've definitely scored the most recent ones, but I think they've done maybe all of them. It's always fantastic to have a soundtrack by New Retrowave, and that's actually something that everybody gets by backing as well. You can get the digital soundtrack when the film is finalized. You'll get a full digital soundtrack.
Fuck yeah! Well, great work on the trailer with the soundtrack. That's what got me hyped. I look forward to, the next year as everything develops and getting to be along for the ride. And thanks for joining us today. If any of our listeners wanted to follow you, should they just follow Terrorbytes specifically, or do you want them to find you and find your other work as well?
Yeah. I mean, by all means, do both. Terrorbytes Doc on all socials. So that's your Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I believe we'll have a TikTok. That's where you can follow specifically for the series and cast announcements and, updates on the live events and stuff like that. So definitely follow those to see how we're developing things, and we'll post sneak peeks and stuff. And then if you want to follow just me as an individual, I do lots of other stuff as well. I've got like a personal YouTube channel I run as a side hobby that does a bunch of horror analysis and stuff. Like, this is kind of my lifeblood. I am Dan Drambles on everywhere. So Dan Drambles on Twitter, Dan Drambles on Instagram. Just Dan Drambles or Dan_Drambles. I can't remember which one I am on, which one of them has the no underscore, one of them has an underscore, but I'm easy enough to find.
Yeah, those will all be in the episode description as well. I'll make sure to look all those up, so if people want to find them, check out the episode description.
Yeah, and Dan Drambles on YouTube as well, of course, because that's where my biggest sort of platform is for my own stuff.
Awesome. Well, very exciting. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll have a link to the Terrorbytes webpage. Make sure you get there and get a chance to jump on the campaign in its early phases, get access to that first-person doc, as well as all the other amazing perks. And yeah, that's all we got for you today. Thanks for listening, everybody. And thanks again so much, Dan, for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.